Hello, my name is Kira Doherty. I'm a student at Tarleton State University, and today I'm going to be talking about my research study. Uh, it is called Technology Usage and Anxiety and Depression in Adults. As I go through my document that has all of my information in it, I might pause just to readjust so that everything is easier to see because some of my diagrams are a little bit smaller. So just bear with me. Thanks. First, I'm going to begin with the introduction. The hypothesis for my study was the aim of the study is to find if there is a correlation between screen time and anxiety and depression amounts in adults of differing ages specifically. The gap being filled with my research is that there are not any other studies that I could find that talked about anxiety and depression related to adults of all ages. The only studies that I could find were of adolescents and children and young adults up to the ages of 20 to 24. And in a lot of the studies that I've read, usually researchers only explored one type of technology or they delved into different subsets of that technology. So, like if you were talking about computers, then they would talk about social media. Um, or if you were talking about cell phones, then they would talk about texting specifically. And so I wanted to get a broader scope of all kinds of technology, and I also wanted to get a broader scope of it regarding adults because adults hadn't really been studied before. The independent variable in this study is the amount of time that technology was used, and the dependent variables are anxiety levels, depression levels, and they are measured with the HADS, Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, which was discovered by Zygmunt and Snaith in 1983. My prediction for this study was that there would be a positive correlation between anxiety and depression and higher technology usage in adults, because that was what I found whenever I was researching online about whether or not there was a correlation. A high majority of them in children and young adults did show a positive correlation, and so that's where my prediction came from. Next up is the methods section, and so I'll read about my methods and then I'll kind of zoom into this pie chart so that you can see it. But the participants in my study, there were 59 participants, 47 were females, 11 were males, and one identified as non-binary. The ages range from 18 to 74, and I actually have this chart right here that is broken down into the ages of people and the percentages of those ages. So I'll zoom into that. So as you can see here, I had 32.2% of my subjects that were 18 to 24 years old. I had 23.7% of my subjects that were 25 to 34 years old. I had 13.6% of my subjects that were 35 to 44 years old. I had 25.4% of my subjects that were 45 to 54 years old. And then I had 3.4% of my subjects who were 55 to 64 years old. And then 1.7% of my subjects were 65 to 74 years old. And I didn't have any subjects that were over 75, even though that was an option. So next up were my procedures. I created a self-reporting survey created in Google Forms, and then I distributed it online through Tarleton's Blackboard discussion post, and then I also shared it on social media with my family and friends. Specifically, I used Facebook, and that's where I got a large majority of my subjects. I gave them informed consent, and they had to agree to taking my survey voluntarily before they could fill it out. And then I did the study using convenient sampling just because of the time constraints. It was a lot easier to find people nearby who could take my survey. And the measures that I used were demographic data, so I recorded data about the gender and the age of all of my subjects, and then I had them self-report the hours that they use technology weekly, and I also had them report their preferred method of technology. And then I had them take the HADS assessment, which I scored later, and that takes us to the results section. So next up is the results section. For usage of technology, I determined that the median minimum hours of technology usage per week for that group was 32.37, and then the standard deviation was 18.127, and then the rate of anxiety, the mean was 9.82, and the standard deviation was 4.23. And so those are the scores that I compiled for the anxiety portion of the HADS scale. And then this was what I compiled for the rate of depression. The mean was 4.847, and then the standard deviation was 3.377. And then I determined that using a Pearson correlation and regression analysis would be the best way to tackle this data. And so the anxiety Pearson correlation coefficient that I got was negative 0.053, and the depression Pearson correlation coefficient that I got was negative 0.068. And so that determined there were slight negative correlations on both the anxiety and depression in comparison to the minimum hours of technology use that were documented. And then here's my anxiety regression equation and my depression regression equation. And I discovered that neither correlation was statistically significant, and so I did reject the null hypothesis. And then I will pause and zoom in on them. Here I have my scatter plots that help to determine my correlation between anxiety scores and minimum hours of technology used, and then depression scores and minimum hours of technology used. As you can see, they were not what I predicted. They were not a positive correlation, and then they were also not statistically significant. So whenever I took data, I also asked my participants if they had a preferred method of technology, and I had them choose between 5 different technologies. And so the highest picked one was definitely cell phones, with 61% of the subjects picking cell phones as their most used technology. And the second was actually computer and laptop, followed by television, and then tablet and video gaming systems tied for last. And so I'm wondering if that may have something to do with the way that the correlation turned out. A lot more of the positive correlative studies that I came across involved computers. And then I also compiled some data based on the 3 ways that people could score on the hospital anxiety and depression scale. And so there were 3 ways. If you made between a 0 and a 7 on that scale, then you would be within the normal range. And so I had to go through and I had to calculate each person's score. And then if you were borderline abnormal, you were 8 to 11. And then if you were abnormal, then you were like 12 to 21, I believe was the score. And so of the scores, I got a mode of 11.5 in the anxiety portion for my whole group, and then I also got a 3.5 for the mode of depression. And I thought that was kind of interesting because 11.5 technically falls into the borderline abnormal range, whereas 3.5 actually falls into the normal range. And so I have this over here that also shows the percentage of people that fell into the normal, borderline abnormal, and abnormal sections. And so this one was for anxiety and this one was for depression. And as you can see, a lot more people fell into the abnormal category for anxiety, and a large majority of the people fell into a normal range for depression. That brings us to the discussion section of my research project. It was predicted that the correlation between technology usage and wow. I can't edit that last part out, so we're just going to keep it rolling. It was predicted that the correlation between technology usage and anxiety and depression levels in adults would be positive. The data collected did not conclude this, as there was a negative correlation and the data was not statistically significant. The limitations of this study were that I had a small sample size. It was only 59 people. A majority of the studies that I looked at had like a minimum of 200 and up to thousands. And so I just didn't have the time to do that, nor did I have the manpower to go through and score hundreds of HADS scales. And so if I was telling somebody to do this in the future, then I would definitely say get a larger group to score all of that and try to do it with a larger sample size. I did not survey people with excessive technological use. A lot of the studies that I looked over did include where they had targeted people specifically because they use technology excessively. And so that may have resulted in more of a positive correlation for them. There may be a reason that studies are only reported about young adults and children when talking about anxiety and depression in regard to technology use. There may not be a correlation when it comes to these things and adults, because I sure didn't find any research on it. Advice for future researchers would be use larger sample size, use fewer variables. There was a lot of variables to cover and a lot of things. And I wish that I had focused more just on the correlation portion of all of this. Focus on a smaller age range. So I used 18 to 74 as my age range, and that was quite a spread of people. I think if I were to do it again, I would want to use just one of the age ranges that I had. So I had like 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and so on. And so I'd probably want to use one of those smaller ones. And maybe don't use the HADS scale, as there was a large difference in the depression and anxiety data collected in this study from it. I thought it was kind of weird that there were so many high scores for anxiety, but not that many high scores for depression. And that could just have to do with the group that I had. That could just have to do with the fact that I didn't get that many people. And it could also have to do a lot with, I believe, the current political climate and anxiety that people may feel about racial riots and the pandemic and things like that. So there are a lot of outside influences that I think should be taken into account, especially at this point in time. Due to many limitations, my study cannot prove or disprove any theories and does not at all describe information about the constructs involving children, because I surveyed adults. The study might warrant looking further into whether or not there's any kind of correlation between the variables tested. So I think that this definitely asks more questions than it answers. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because it didn't give me anything that let me really prove anything, but it also left it open so that somebody else can do better research than I did, because I am very new to all of this. So down here I have my references, which are also cited in my paper. And that is the end. Thank you, and have a great day.